Recording in progress.
Okay. Good evening to everybody and those that are on Zoom. I feel bad for those of you that are starting this series tonight. We're on lesson number 10. And I'll just tell you that in May and June of this year, my wife and I went on a tour with a Christian group, and we went to Israel. And then we went to Turkey and saw the 7 churches of Asia that are mentioned in Revelation. And then we went to Greece. And the good news is that in 3 weeks from tonight, we're going to have half the class will be a review of all the places we went to with just a few slides instead of the hundreds of slides that we've seen. We had over 700 pictures, 7,000 pictures, and I've narrowed it down to a couple of thousand for these presentations. But tonight we're actually through with the 7 churches of Asia. We looked last week at Ephesus as the last one, but I'll show you a slide in a minute that has a picture of where they all were over in Eastern Turkey. But we're going to stay in the Ephesus area for a minute. I had planned to show this at the end of last week or 2 weeks ago. I didn't teach last week because of my injury. But this is right next to Ephesus. And this is the Basilica of St. John, the person who wrote Revelation. And it's just outside Ephesus. And you see there, you're looking at it with the columns, but in the background is a fort, which was built a couple of hundred years later to protect the church that was built that's now ruins. But you don't have to read all that, but we don't know in the Bible that John ever traveled to Ephesus, but tradition says that he came to Ephesus after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And some say he brought his mother, which would have been Mary, Jesus' mother. But you know, when I go back and look at that, if it was AD 70, he would have been about 70 years old then, and his mother would have been 85 or more. So I'm not sure that she did. And we don't have anything other than tradition. Some people say she came to Ephesus too. But after he had been there for a while, one of the Roman Caesars sent him to exile on the Isle of Patmos. But another Caesar later on, when they started looking more favorably at Christianity, allowed him to be released, tradition says, and come back to Ephesus. And that's where he asked to be buried. So we're just going to run through these slides pretty quickly, but they just show the facade of the old chapel that was once quite a fancy chapel. And it was built about 400 years after John would have lived, so about 500 AD. But there was another smaller church built there before this was built over the top of it. Now there is supposedly his grave. And that block right there, if I can get my pointer to work, and it's not working. So anyway, there's what's on the block. It says the tomb of St. John. So we don't know that from the Bible, but that's what tradition says. So I just took a bunch of pictures because it was a pretty elaborate church building that was built over the top of this tomb. Of course, now is in ruins. I thought maybe that was going to be the tomb, but you're looking in and you're looking at a mirror. So you're looking at yourself. And I don't really know what that room is there for, but you're looking through bars, as you can see. And there were a couple of pictures. More ruins. And that's the fort, which I said was built to protect. So it's on the highest ground. The church wasn't built on the highest part of the hill, but it is overlooking Ephesus. And there's one last view of that, some of the walls that existed. That's one of the oldest synagogues in the area. That synagogue was built in 3 AD, or about 200 years after John would have been there, but it's still quite an old synagogue. There's the baptistry that was in the church that they built. And these are storks, aren't they, Donna?
Yeah.
Okay, so storks have made their home in the parking lot, and that was just something to take several pictures of. So we did. So now you know where babies come from, right? I got a long flight from Israel. Yeah, actually from Turkey. Okay, in just a minute, we're going to move down to the port, which is Kusadasi. I think I'm pronouncing that the way most Americans do. But inside that circle is Ephesus, which is 14 miles away. Do you remember that Ephesus used to be a port and it was on the ocean, but the bay that went up there silted through, so it's just dry land now. It's about 12 miles from the ocean now. But we looked at Ephesus last week, extensive ruins there, and that would have been where Paul actually lived, and we walked some of the same streets that he walked, as I showed you last time. There's another picture of a couple of ways to get up to Ephesus. I'm not sure why. There, my pointer did work. There's Ephesus, and we're down here at Kusadasi in just a minute. So that's the port of Kusadasi. When we bought our tickets, they said we were going to go see some islands, but I don't guess I understood that we were going to be on a regular cruise ship. I thought we were going to be on some little ship that just took us to islands, but we were on a cruise ship that I'll show you in a moment, and it was quite nice. And there's part of our group. We had 48 people, as I told you, and the Turkey part and the Greece part of this trip. I don't know whether you know any of them, but they were from quite a few places in the United States. So we did take a few pictures. There's the ship that we're going to go on. And some people had already come from Athens and had come over here. But this port is a very busy port. About 6 years ago, Donna and I cruised in the Mediterranean and we came to Ephesus. We came into the same port. But there are cruise ships in here all the time. And you can see you're parked to another, next to another one there. And in a minute, as we leave the harbor, you'll see there's actually 2 other cruise ships there. So it's a busy port, mainly for people that want to go into Ephesus or see other of the 7 churches of Asia. If you've ever been on a cruise ship, well, you know they're not the biggest rooms. So that's the width of the room there. You can push the beds together and you can keep them apart like that. And our porter used the towels and would design things. You can kind of see over there on the right that he made some kind of animal there. My wife went down to a thing where they were showing how to carve watermelons, or at least showing what they did. I don't know that she learned how to do that, but there's a face in the watermelon. And they did serve 3 meals on this ship, and it moves along pretty fast. So we are headed out now for several Greek islands, but the first one we were headed to is the Isle of Patmos, where John was a prisoner. And when we got there, you can't get up to the dock because it's not deep enough, so you have to take a little boat that holds about 100 people. You take several of those and you get on that and you cruise over to the dock. But there's that picture that I told you about. There's the Isle of Patmos, and you can see where the cave of the Acropolis is, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And there are the 7 churches of Asia that we've talked about for the last several weeks in Eastern Turkey. So there we are on that little ship, leaving the big cruise ship. And one of the things you notice on the Isle of Patmos is that big fort up there. And yet it's not a fort, it's a monastery. It's called the Monastery of St. John. And it was built up there in about, I'll have to remember, I think I've written it down here somewhere if I can find it. I think it was about 550 AD. So it was built after John lived there several hundred years. But we're getting on a bus because we're going to go up the hill, and they spell apocalypse a little differently than we do. But does somebody know what the word apocalypse means? Well, it basically means, go
I
ahead.
want to say the end of days.
Yeah, the end of the world, really. And it's talking about a traumatic end of the world. But of course, many people misinterpret Revelation, in my opinion. And there are people that say that Revelation teaches that Jesus is going to come back to the earth and he's going to set up a 1,000-year reign. Nowhere in the Bible does it say there's going to be 1,000-year reign. And as a matter of fact, it says that when Jesus comes back, every eye is going to look up, and those that are in Christ are going to meet him in the air. So I do not believe that the church is ever going to be in Jerusalem, that it's going to be refounded. There's not going to be a temple because we are the temple as New Testament Christians. But in any event, there is a coming end of days. And Revelation says, get ready. That's one of the things it says. But the primary message of the book of Revelation is to the churches that are there. Despite all your persecutions, I want you to know that we have won, that Satan has been defeated. Revelation is a book of victory, if you will. Okay, so we got on a sidewalk and we were told this is a place of worship. It's actually inside a Greek Orthodox church. And so they ask women to have their heads covered and to dress appropriately. And we're walking down the hill and we're going to go in that door right over there. It doesn't look too assuming, but that's actually going in the basement of the church building. And there is a cave there. Tradition says that John was exiled to a cave. There were other exiles besides him. I have no reason to doubt, but this was the cave. But I don't know that of my own, and the Bible doesn't tell us that. But anyway, you're looking down where the ship was, and you're looking at some of the harbor area. It's quite a tourist attraction now because of the cave that we're talking about. And there we are looking up at the monastery. And even though I didn't like to climb stairs, it was mainly a sloping ramp, and I did walk up there to that. But there's that doorway again, and we're getting a little closer. And we go inside, and it shows you the layout of some of the things there. But the important thing is getting in through that door to the cave itself. Now, later on, my wife told me I was not supposed to take any pictures. I understood you weren't supposed to use a flash. So I took 2 pictures without a flash, maybe 3. I guess I took 3. But I'm not going to read all of this, but you can look in your own Bible at Revelation 1, verses 1 through 11, which says it's the revelation of Jesus. And God gave it to the bondservants about what was soon going to take place. And he sent communications by his angel to John, who testified because he was an eyewitness to Jesus living on the earth and everything he had seen. And it says, blessed is the one who reads. You remember every time he addressed a church, he said, you that have an ear, hear. Well, here he's telling us that if you read this, you hear it. Listen to what he's saying. And so it is primarily to the 7 churches of Asia, but he said to share it with all Christians. And so it's to us as well. And so he goes on to say, he made us into a kingdom, and we are priests, as I've already stated. Let's go to the next page just briefly. It says, behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. So it is to be. And then he goes on to say, in verse 9, I, John, your brother and fellow participant in the tribulation of the kingdom, in perseverance of Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So it's because he was being persecuted. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet saying, write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches. And then he names them. Okay, well, that's one of the pictures I took without the flash. And that's where they say he would have stood and written. Now, I don't know how they know that. He might have just put his tablet on the rock and written there. And I also read somewhere that tradition says that he had a scribe that was with him as well. So maybe the scribe wrote those things. I don't know. But that's also just to the left of where he was standing, and that's men's ideas of various depictions of things. Jesus on his throne over to the right, and I'm not exactly sure what some of these other things are. And I did take the 3rd picture. That's my cousin that I told you. We just happened to go on the same tour, even though he lives in Colorado. I thought that was great. But when we were on the bus, they showed us these pictures. And Donna said I should have listened, because that's when they said don't take pictures. But here's what it looks like inside. You can see the stand over there in some of those pictures. And then that's a depiction of one of the pictures. Okay, so we're now leaving the cave, and we're headed up to the monastery. But just because we're also sightseers, as we head up this sloping path that winds around quite a bit, there are lots of stores and things selling things. And then it says, well, you can look at the windmills if you go this way. I didn't do that, but my cousin did and took some pictures. There, you see the windmills off to the right-hand side. Here's a close-up. And another closer up. A lot of Greek islands have windmills. We went to another island 6 years ago that had windmills on it too. Looks a lot like that. Now we're headed for the monastery. And you had to have an entry ticket, but our guides had gotten a ticket for us. So we were able to get up there and see it. It's still in use, and there are monks up there. One of the interesting things I found out, just reading here recently, is they actually have 10 chapels here, because they say you can't use a chapel more than once a day. So if you go in to say a prayer or preach a sermon or sing a song in a chapel, when you leave there, you can't go back the same day. I'm not sure why, but that explains why we saw several chapels. We didn't go to all 10 of them. So there's one of the monks. At least I think that's what he's called. And there's one of the chapels. It was very ornate, because it was built, like I said, in probably the 5th century. There are some of the pictures that are there. There were lots of things to look at, but I didn't necessarily know what any of them meant, so I just took pictures of a bunch of things. You'll have to go online if you want more detail. That was going into the museum. More pictures up on the ceiling. They have bells there that are rung at particular times of the day, but I don't know when. Donna, would you help me take the photo off, please? I can take it off if you just think. Thank you. Okay, you can see our ship down there. You also took my microphone. I apologize, because I gave it to you. I wondered who was talking. So there we are looking out over the harbor. I'll just tow this in our ship again. And lots of tourists. And this is where we're coming back down to get on the bus to go back down to the harbor. Now, we're going to go to another Greek island. And if you have the outline, you know that we're going to Rhodes. Now, before we went on the trip, the tour guide asked different men to prepare lessons. And I got to teach a lesson about where David and Goliath fought. And I showed you that when we were in Israel. And I also got to teach a lesson about this island, Rhodes. Well, Rhodes is mentioned in the Bible. How about that? I'll go back to that map in a minute. But in Acts 21:1, it says, when we had parted from them, we had set sail. We went on a straight course to Cos, and on the next day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. This was the end of Paul's third missionary journey. And if you want to know where Cos is, I looked it up a little while ago. There's Cos, and Patmos was up here. We've sailed down, and we're coming to Rhodes. When I tried to teach a lesson, it was 30 minutes long or so, and I'm not going to talk that long about this. But all we know about Paul is that they stopped in Rhodes. But I'll tell you that there were at least 2 churches on Rhodes in the first century. Now, how did they get there? Was it Paul? I just would point out that Paul's method was wherever he went, he told people about Jesus. And so it's entirely possible that on the ship approaching, I'm going to say it right in a minute, Rhodes, he may have talked to somebody that lived there and converted them. Or maybe he talked to somebody who then talked to somebody and converted them. In any event, Paul liked to spread the gospel, and Rhodes actually had churches in the first century. We don't know how they got there for sure. I'll tell you in a minute that Rhodes is famous for something. It's not a big island. It's spear-shaped. It has a point up there. The interesting thing is it's a Greek island, but it's only 11 miles from Turkey, and it's 226 miles from the mainland of Greece. But those are all Greek islands when things were divided up. And we're going to come back to this city later. It's a famous city. But this island was famous for what's called the statue of Colossus. And it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it's supposedly about 150 feet tall. Some say he straddled the harbor, but others say it wouldn't have been wide enough, or he couldn't have stood wide enough for ships to come in between his legs. But it was a big statue, and if you see on the outline, it says that it was built in 280 BC, and then it was destroyed. When man builds something, he may think he's built it for ever, for a long time, but it came down in an earthquake in 226 BC, which would have been just about 54 years later. Well, we drove down the island, and I started not to even show you this because this doesn't have any significance, as far as I know, to the Bible. But this is what's called the Acropolis of Lindos, and part of it was a temple to a god, and I forgot the name of the female god, but it was built in about the 4th century BC. And it remained a fort through the Greeks and the Romans and the Ottoman Empire, and it was very well fortified, and it helped to defend the island. But another reason that I put this in here is this was a little more than halfway down the east side of the island. And so we got to see some of the roadside, although I didn't take too many pictures. There were some wheat fields and some grazing fields. And in 2023, that's this year, in the spring, they had terrible fires, wildfires on the island of Rhodes. And over 30,000 people, I may be exaggerating, 19,000 people, thanks, had to evacuate. And they had to be taken by ships off the island. Well, I did not walk up to that. My wife did. But you could also ride a donkey, and I didn't choose to do that. They said we didn't have time for that. But that's the path going up and down. And you get up there, there are a number of remains of different buildings, including the temple. But those steps right there, I was just reading, They date from 4 BC, so they're old. They've been there a long time. And you got a great view of the harbor, or at least the ocean, I should say. That's my cousin and his wife and his daughter and granddaughter that I've told you about before. And I think he took most of these pictures since I wasn't up there. My wife may have taken a few of them. And that's just kind of showing you the area. Okay, now we are back to the city of Rhodes, and I told you it was a famous city. If you look on the outline, the next to the last line there under Rhodes, it says the city of Rhodes has been cited as the most visited tourist destination in Europe. I couldn't believe that. Why do so many people come to Rhodes? And the reason they do is because Rhodes is one of the only remaining medieval cities that dates about 13 or 1400 AD that still exists in the world. And it's pretty much a complete city. And people that have shops or homes there live in some of these old buildings that are really old. So that's why it's visited by people. It's a real tourist attraction. And so you can see the walls around the city, and there are lots of arches, and these are all ancient. This is a medieval city. And so it was pretty interesting just to walk around. That's a door. Thank you. And it's metal and it's pretty old. There are some cannon outlets, cannons. What I'd call castle towers, medieval castle towers, if you will. They're everywhere. The streets, most of those streets have existed for hundreds of years. They're not paved over. You can see there's just lots of tourists there. There were hundreds or thousands of people there the day we were there. But there you see some of the shops and things in the downtown area. Some interesting designs. I don't know what you call that architectural design, but if I was an architectural student, I would be really interested in that probably. The way it carries the weight. I can't tell you whether that clock tower is part of the original medieval time or whether it was built later. I don't know whether they had clocks in the 13th or 14th century or not. I think they did, actually. There's a picture of the city, and you can see that in red, the walls, and the harbor's where we are up in the upper right there. Some more of the doors as we exit. That's outside, going toward the harbor. And there we are leaving the harbor. And we're going to another island. And you've heard of this island. We're now going to Crete. But I don't know whether you know anything about Crete, even though I've heard about it. And I've seen it on maps of the Mediterranean. And I read about Paul going there on his trip to Rome. I don't guess I knew a whole lot about it, and still don't for that matter. But there we were. I thought it was interesting to be in Crete. And there's a fortification that actually was a protecting wall for this palace that we're going to see. And this palace was Minoan Palace. You can see down at the very bottom of the page. And it was built in 1900 BC. So it was 2,000 years old at the time that Paul would have been alive. And it's pretty well preserved as far as its layout is concerned. And so we were able to walk around and look at a lot of things. There's some fortifications up on that mountain for protection, probably. But there, that looks kind of like a palace there with those columns. But that wall was about all that was left to that. Again, lots of people there. And I think the reason that it's so popular to go there is because Crete's a popular island because people have heard about it. But also, the people that live there, the Minoans, if you'll look at the very bottom there, it was driven out about 1400 BC. And they ended up settling along the coast of what is now Israel. And guess who they were? The Philistines. So I think that's really interesting that they got driven out and they ended up being arch enemies of Israel, the Philistines. Remember, it was Goliath that was a Philistine, and there were always battles going on between the Philistines and Israel. King Saul and his sons were all killed by the Philistines, as we showed you before. I didn't mean to do all that. What did I do? I went backwards 1,000 slides. Apologize. Let's see if I can go forward 1,000 slides. We'll get there maybe. If you miss something, well, you can blink and see it again. We're almost there. I apologize. That's the hard way of doing things. Okay, we're on Crete again. So supposedly we were able to see the chair that the ruler would have sat in as people appeared before him. And that's a terrible picture. I think I have one more. That's the wooden chair he supposedly sat in. Inside what was the palace. There was also the area where the harem would have been as well. Of course, it was ruins as well. So we're not going to spend a whole lot more time there. Those steps probably existed when this whole place was built 2,000 years before. So that was over 4,000 years ago. So they may not look like they're in the best shape in the world, but they're in pretty good shape to be that old. And here we are coming to the main city in Crete, and they said, okay, you can go shopping. You got 2 hours. Now don't get lost. And let me tell you, their streets go every which way. And so I was worried about getting lost. So I think we took pictures of a number of the street signs as we went down, and we ended up not taking too many. We went down to a fountain. There were stores all along there. There was a bigger map that I saw later, but still it was confusing. And see, there's one of the street signs. And we got down to this fountain, which was built in 1629. Well, that's AD, not BC. So it's not that old, but it was an interesting fountain, supposedly. So a lot of pictures were taken there. And then as we walked back up, my wife saw some luggage. It was interesting to her. I don't know whether we got a good deal on it or not, but we got some pieces of luggage. We each bought a carry-on that are really nice. They're name brand carry-ons. And whether we got a good deal or not, we got what we were looking for. They had a good selection, and so we enjoyed doing that. Now we're going to leave that harbor. And my cousin, there was another picture earlier that he took, and I don't know whether I showed you that one. He could find planes flying over just about anywhere we were. And that was taken off from the island of Crete. He had a zoom lens and it's 35 millimeter. And he could take those kind of pictures. But we've actually gotten through a little earlier than usual. If you don't mind, I'm going to take a minute to just tell you that after we were here at Crete, and next week we're going to have a devotional because it's the night before Thanksgiving. The deacons are going to put on that devotional. And then in 2 weeks, we will have lesson number 11. And that's going to be the island of Santorini, which has nothing to do with anything you read in the Bible, but it is a really unusual island. And then we're going to go over to Corinth, which of course does have a lot to do with the Bible, and ultimately Athens. And that will be lesson 12 when we get to Athens. So does anybody have any questions about anything that we've talked about today? I do encourage you to look at the outline. There may be some things on there that I didn't mention or left out. Questions? Well, this wasn't the most entertaining because we didn't get to see a lot of the things that relate back to the Bible. Let me just tell you that with all that's going on in Israel right now, I don't know whether people are ever going to be able to go back to Israel or not. They hope so. Our tour guide has said there have been wars before, and the safest time to go is after a war is over, because they've settled things. So he's hopeful that this will all be over in a few months and he'll be able to conduct other tours, which he's been doing for the last 30 years. He's a member of the church. He and his wife have done these tours for over 30 years. And he knows the ins and outs of Israel and Greece and Turkey. And we were so lucky to have him as our tour guide to organize all this. Well, hopefully nobody will be too unhappy if we end a little early tonight then. If you've gotten warm enough in here, you get to go back out in the cold. People said it was cold outside, but it seemed a little warm in here to me. I apologize for that. So we'll go ahead and you could end the recording and stop the presentation.